So welcome, we're going to get started. We're going to give a little brief presentation about controlling weeds in naturalized areas. So welcome, please huddle in closer, grab those around you. So it seems like as time passes, golf courses are growing in how much of these secondary rough slash naturalized areas slash no-mow areas. They keep growing and growing and growing. Our understanding, on the other hand, of how to manage these areas efficiently is maybe growing at a slower pace. And so really, we as a Nufarm team have worked hard to bring solutions for you to manage these areas more efficiently and to have that beauty that you really want from these areas to really stand out. And the inputs at the same time to be minimal. But as you're going to see as I keep talking, the encouragement to you is make sure that you are putting inputs into these areas somewhat. You can't hold all of them or else you're going to get yourself into trouble. So we're going to talk about some of the benefits of these areas, and I'll show you some pictures of some of the more beautiful sites that I've seen and how they've gotten that way. We'll talk about some of the challenges that we see with these areas, specifically some of the weeds that infiltrate these particular areas and how to control them. And then we're going to introduce to you what Nufarm proposes as a solution for these areas, timings, herbicides, and all around. Now, these areas have many names, so what I'm talking about basically are areas that you stop mowing. Maybe you're mowing them once a year. They could be out of play, but some of them are very in play. Golf balls get hit into them, so it's necessary for people to be able to find the golf ball and then play out of it. If you're anything like me and you hit into these areas, it might take 5 or 6 hits and then you're hitting 5 feet ahead of you each time. So how do you keep these areas thinned out? Much of that has to do with keeping the weeds out, whether it's grassy weeds or perennial broadleaf weeds. A lot of different species you can plant, so if you haven't planted these areas, it's worth taking the time to really look through what's going to benefit your course, whether you're in the south and in an arid region, or whether you're in more temperate regions in the north. What's best for your course? What's going to survive with zero inputs? And what's going to look the best in certain areas. If you have really wet areas, there may be a specific species that suits that area versus another. So you may even use different species for different parts of your golf course, depending on what's there. So this is kind of a list of really all the things that you may be looking at. And if we took a survey of all the golf course superintendents out there and we asked them what species are you planting on your golf course for these no-mow areas, most of them are still at the fine fescue. They're seeding hard fescues, but some kind of fine fescue into these areas for a couple of reasons. They survive really well. That beauty aspect really stands out as they produce seed heads, as they have that inflorescence from year to year. You get that heather effect of it blowing in the wind. And you can also spray certain grassy weed herbicides in them to keep the grassy weeds out. And as we all know, keeping grasses out of grasses selectively is a difficult thing to do. So your area may look like this, where you have plants kind of sparsely through regions. You may have some of these areas mulched in between. This is Arcadia Bluffs, one of my favorite golf courses in Michigan, and it really works well in some poor soil conditions. So this is on the shores, it's on a bluff, obviously, Arcadia Bluffs of Lake Michigan, and so you can imagine it's pretty much 100% stand. But these fine fescues do really well with zero irrigation, no fertility, and they stay thin in these types of areas when you can keep those inputs out. Most people recognize this in Oregon. A lot of fine fescue in there. Erin Hills in Wisconsin, and you see those seed heads that are produced in those no-mow areas, and they spend a lot of time. They have somebody that goes out with a backpack controlling weeds in these particular areas. And so, what are the benefits of these areas? We can reduce inputs, we know that. One of the obvious ones is less mowing, right? So if you're mowing a fairway multiple times per week, if you're mowing your greens every day, it's nice to be able to have some areas, vast areas often, that you're only mowing once per year. And some people will mow them twice per year. But the recommendation still is maybe once per year, because every time you're mowing these areas, you're increasing lateral growth versus vertical growth, which means they're going to start to fill in, they're going to get more dense. And what you really want is thinned out areas so that they're not competing with each other, so they can produce more inflorescence. That also means as you have thinned out areas, you're going to deal with weeds inherently, right? So reduced mowing, reduced irrigation, reduced fertility. You may do some of these things when you're establishing these grasses, but you don't have to afterwards, and that's really the draw. I think it's some of the other benefits that people like the most, and it's the beauty aspect, it's the texture on a golf course, it's foliage that moves with the wind versus what you might see on a fairway, and diversified species of birds and insects, even just animals that you maybe wouldn't otherwise see on a golf course. And then when we talk about challenges, they are numerous as well. Weeds, obviously when you're dealing with a perennial plant from year to year and you're mowing very little, perennial weeds are going to infiltrate that area, grasses and broadleaves alike. Inflorescence, some of the things that you may do may limit how many seed heads are produced by these plants. If they thicken out, they're going to be limited in the amount of inflorescence that they produce. Tire tracks, if you decide to drive through these areas or spray them in the middle of the season, you're going to see tire tracks for the whole season. And so when do you get out and spray these areas for weeds? And then lodging, as they thicken up, as these areas get thick, they can fall over and just fall on top of each other if they get too thick. So how do you keep them thinned out? And then reduced playability. If you have any of these areas that are in play, most of us are familiar with hitting a golf ball in there in these particular areas and maybe not even being able to find your golf ball. So how do you keep speed of play up? How do you help people to be able to find their balls and play out of these areas by keeping them thin? These are all questions that we don't have the perfect answer for yet. Like much of what we do, a lot of the science that we're doing, it's progressing. And so this is progressing as well. There's a lot of herbicides out there. And remember, your timing is limited for spraying herbicides to control weeds. It's either going to be in the fall or the spring, or you're going to be putting a backpack on and spraying, spot treating with a backpack throughout these areas, which can take a lot of time depending on how much acreage you have. And then burning. Not everybody can burn, but it can be a huge asset. If you can burn these areas, you can get rid of a lot of the material for one thing, where a ball might get buried under that material. You can get rid of weeds very quickly by burning. So this is what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid something that maybe seemed like a good idea at one point, and after you actually did it, you're realizing that maybe there's more inputs or there's more of a downside than you thought. So the idea that we're trying to bring to these areas is how can we keep inputs low but still get the most out of them. So I was able to do some research at Michigan State University not too long ago, and we looked at some very basic things. Is a fall-timed application better than a spring-timed application? Is it necessary to have a pre-emergence herbicide in that mix? We're not seeing lots of annual plants, but one of the biggest things that came out of this is something very elementary. It's that it really didn't matter if you sprayed a herbicide in the fall or if you sprayed a herbicide in the spring. It just mattered that you sprayed a herbicide pretty regularly. Even the herbicide you chose didn't matter a whole lot. And of course, we see pockets in these areas where you may have nutsedge take over in low areas where you have standing water pretty often. You see pockets where maybe quackgrass starts to take over, or reed canary grass. It's a very, you have very localized problems in different areas in these no-mow or naturalized areas. So you have to choose your herbicide well, know that it has activity on that particular weed, and then you actually have to get out there and spray it, because these are the last areas that superintendents often want to think about. They're low input, they don't want to put much energy into it, they want to think about their putting greens and fairways. My encouragement to you is make sure that you're getting out there at least once a year to deal with some of the weeds that may be encroaching. Because if you don't, for a 2-year or 3-year period, you're going to turn around and it's going to be a bigger problem than you know how to deal with. Whether it's quackgrass, whether it's Canada thistle, it doesn't matter. These perennial weeds seem to proliferate very quickly. So the takeaway that I got from a lot of this research is do something. Make an application every year, whether it's with a backpack or broadcast in fall or spring. A pre-emergence application can really help if you do have annual grasses that are infiltrating or even annual broadleaf weeds, but it also helps with these grasses that are reseeding themselves. Remember that we're letting them produce seeds That's really where a lot of the aesthetics come from, and those seeds are being disseminated right back into that soil. So if we want to limit how much germination is happening by those species that we planted in the first place so that it doesn't get too thick, a pre-emergence can help you limit that. And then we have herbicides that we can use in fine fescue, particularly to take out other perennial grasses. So fluazepop and sethoxidin are great weapons to remove perennial grasses from a fine fescue stand. And you may have more infiltrating than you think. This was an area where I didn't really think we had many grassy weeds, but you can see all that injury. None of what is injured is fine fescue. All of what is injured is a infiltrating perennial grass, whether it's quackgrass, often it's reed canary grass, but these grasses can come in and sneak up on you. You don't realize that they're infiltrating, so use these herbicides that are at your disposal. Canada thistle seems to run rampant in these areas. It's a perennial weed that spreads via creeping roots, and so it can take over whole areas, but you see how it's localized. So you may be able to handle it with a backpack pretty easily. And starting these areas off, if you're starting from scratch and you're going to seed them, there are some common best management practices that you should use. If you want to keep them thin, that means you have to seed thin. So if we're used to seeding maybe 6 pounds of seed per 1,000 square feet, you got to divide that by 10 or more. We're talking about seeding rates that maybe they're using in Oregon for seed production. You don't want too many plants per unit area, and so therefore you really have to reduce your seeding rate when you start, and that's really key for keeping these areas thinned out. So 10 pounds of seed per acre is a good starting point. And then take advantages of the herbicides that you can use in these areas right from the get-go. I've had questions, should I let it establish for a few years before I start spraying herbicides? And I would say certainly not. You should get out there and try to control those weeds when they first infiltrate. That's when they haven't put much energy into rootstock, they haven't put much energy into all these vegetative parts. And they're young, they're immature, they're easier to control. So you need to get on them right away. And then make sure you don't have irrigation heads going into these areas. Make sure you're not getting fertility into them. It's a key for keeping them thinned out, but also if you have irrigation heads hitting them, you'll see areas that get lodged over or fall over. That's one thing that can cause them to lodge over. And again, if they fall over, it's that way for the entire season. Most people are mowing late in the fall or early in the fall sometimes, and then letting weeds emerge through that material and then spraying a herbicide. That can work really well. A fall-timed application of a herbicide is really good agronomy. It makes sense because active ingredients move with sugars, so a sugar movement in the fall is down to the roots. That's where you want your active ingredient to move. The key is, and I'm going to say it again, is that you want to make sure you're making an application per year. It doesn't matter if it's in the fall. If you can't get to it in the fall, make sure you get back in the spring to make that application. And we'll talk about spring applications at some point. So this is what our marketing team has put a lot of energy is this chart right here. And it's based on some of the research that I'm going to show you. And we have some charts right here if you want to come and grab them. But it's some of the products that we have in our portfolio and how you might use them for these naturalized areas. So if we look at Millennium Ultra, which has clopyralid in it, which isn't for residential use, but you can use it on your golf course. It has specific use for weeds like Canada thistle. Clopyralid is a great herbicide for control of thistles in particular. And so on that weed in particular, Millennium Ultra has great activity, and it also has a good spectrum of weed control. So Millennium Ultra can kind of be your go-to, not only for these naturalized areas, but for fairways and for other roughs that you are mowing as well. You can apply it in the fall or the spring. You can put it in a backpack. It's a very versatile herbicide for you to use on your golf course. There's some Canada thistle earlier in the season. It doesn't look like too big of a problem, but if you turn your back on that problem, you don't make an application that spring, this is what can happen. It can explode on you, and those small plants become these very large plants with lots of stored carbohydrates. They become much more difficult to control and actually kill. And you can see that plot in there. That's a plot where we did apply a herbicide and controlled all that Canada thistle. So you can see how well it worked when you applied it in the spring. So spring, fall, the key is make sure you're making that application. This is some common milkweed. I run into lots of superintendents who want to keep common milkweed around for pollinators, for monarch butterflies in particular. And so they want to keep their common milkweed around, which makes sense. So how do you control other broadleaves in these areas and keep some around? It's a very difficult thing to do, right? We don't have herbicides that are too selective for some broadleaves and not others, but we have found that Millennium Ultra, so we have Native Clean, Millennium Ultra plus non-ionic surfactant, Millennium Ultra plus an organosilicone surfactant, Sure Power, and then a couple other herbicide mixes. A taller bar means we had better control of common milkweed. And you can see how gentle Millennium Ultra plus a non-ionic surfactant was on common milkweed. So it's a good option if you want to keep milkweed around for the most part. It's a little gentler chemistry that you can go out and apply and still keep some of those plants around and kill the other plants that might take over in those areas. It's also important to note that if you do want to keep common milkweed around, use a non-ionic surfactant. Stay away from that organosilicone surfactant. Here's some pictures. There's Millennium Ultra on the left, on your left, with that gentler chemistry on common milkweed. They're kind of sticking around. Sure Power lights out on common milkweed, just burning them down very quickly, and then the untreated on the right. So we talked about Millennium Ultra. That's very versatile. Sure Power is another herbicide that is great for these areas, and one of the reasons is because you can burn down plants very, very quickly. A lot of the herbicides that you might apply and you're not mowing these areas, those weeds might stick around for a while. You still might see them for much of the season after you spray a herbicide, even though they're going to die. So Sure Power has a PPO, or a burn down active ingredient, in it. So you can make these weeds disappear much more quickly with a product like Sure Power. So whether you're going to put it in a backpack or you're going to spray later in the fall, with Sure Power, it's a really good option to burn down these weeds. This is 2 days after application on Canada Thistle. It's also a great rescue treatment, so I call it a rescue treatment, where maybe you've let these areas go and you have annual grasses coming in, you have sedges coming in, you have broadleaves coming in. It has activity on kind of all of those weeds at the same time, so with one fell swoop you can come in and spray a herbicide, get fast activity, and burn down a lot of these weeds all at once with one product. So a nice rescue treatment for no-mow areas or these naturalized areas when you've kind of turned your back on them for a couple of years. So that was Sure Power, Millennium Ultra we talked about. 4-Speed XT kind of has its own little niche, I think. When you did forget to make your application, or you didn't find time to make your application in the fall, you can come back in the spring. And 4-Speed XT actually has a burn down active ingredient also, which helps that active ingredient, the other active ingredients, get into those weeds, get to the active site and kill them. We all know that when plants aren't growing, it's really difficult to control them. And so that early spring application, which is often necessary in these naturalized areas because you don't want to drive through them when they're growing, when they're green and lush. You want to make that application early. It's difficult to control weeds early in the season when it's cool up. And so we found that 4-Speed XT can be a really great weapon at that timing, that early spring timing. And so here's some data showing Dandelion Control. This was in Michigan, but again, a taller bar means better control. On Dandelion, it's much like a lot of the perennial broadleaf weeds that you're going to see in these areas. You see 4-Speed XT kind of stand out as a really good product that has a lot of activity really early in the season when it's still cool. So a good weapon for naturalized areas early in the spring. And then Sure Power, Q-Ball, Solero. There's always these pockets that I mentioned. These localized areas of maybe sedge in a low area where you have no-mow areas or naturalized areas. Maybe pockets of crabgrass where it's really thinned out and you've got a lot of annual grasses germinating and becoming a big part of that stand, and you want to take them out. Sure Power, like I said, has activity on a broad range of different weeds, so that can be a nice rescue treatment. But if it's mostly crabgrass coming in, Q-Ball or quinclorac can give you great activity in thinned out areas. And then Solero is absolutely lights out on Kalinga and yellow nut sedge or other sedges that might come into those low areas. That might be a great addition to put in your backpack and kind of walk into those areas and make sure you're cleaning them out before they get out of control. Cheetah Pro, this is glufosinate. It's a good option for maybe just thinning out areas. If they're getting too thick, you can use something like glufosinate to knock down certain areas within stands just to thin them out with a herbicide. And you can see how you can see those tire tracks. This was in the middle of a season. They made an application. You can see the tire tracks through the very edge of this naturalized area, and those are tracks that you're going to see the rest of the season. So making sure you're either walking in with a backpack in the middle of the season, or you're making that application earlier in the spring is really important. So Sure Power on the left, those rescue treatments, cue ball in the center when you have thinned out areas, maybe they're newly seeded, they're exactly how you want them. You want them thinned out so they're producing lots of inflorescence so that they're still playable. You can find a golf ball, but you want to control the crabgrass, and again, could produce more and more seed, disseminate more and more seed, and become a bigger problem the next year. Make sure you're controlling it with something like cue ball. And then Solero, you see all that yellow nutsedge in that stand right there. This is a low area to golf course in Michigan, and it's just taking over the entire area. And then SureGuard. SureGuard may be a product that you aren't as familiar with, but this is a great pre-emergence herbicide that has some early post-emergence activity, non-selective. So you could use it in certain areas, in naturalized areas that are very, very thin, maybe areas where you have plant or ornamental grasses that are far apart and you have lots of space in between. And this is when you want a pre-emergence to do the work for you. You want a pre-emergence to sit in that soil and have residual and control weeds as they try to germinate through those areas. These are the types of areas I think about using products like SureGuard, and you can directly spray them in between these plants to kill some of the smaller weeds that are coming in and have pre-emergence activity all at the same time and do your job for you over the entire season. So that's our list of solutions for you. If you have any questions, feel free to come up and ask. And if you want any literature, we have that as well. Thank you.